June 20th, 1944. The Philippine Sea. A Japanese aircraft carrier burns against the twilight sky, her flight deck erupting in geysers of flame. This is IJN Hiyō, a ship converted from a luxury liner, pressed into desperate service as Japan's carrier fleet died around her. Within hours, she would slip beneath the waves with over 250 men still aboard, taking her secrets to a depth that has kept her hidden for 8 decades. No expedition has ever found her. No ROV has filmed her remains. But the story of what happened that day, pieced together from survivor accounts, declassified American attack reports, and Japanese naval archives, reveals a ship that was never supposed to be in that battle. A converted liner with structural flaws her crew knew about. A carrier operating far beyond her design limits. And evidence suggesting she carried more than official records acknowledge. The wreck of Hiyo remains lost somewhere in 16,000 feet of water. But the questions she took down don't need a discovery to be answered. They're written in survivor testimonies that contradict official reports, in manifests that don't match escort destroyer logs, in the pattern of explosions that tore her apart from within before the ocean could claim her. IJN Hiyō wasn't built to be a warship. She was the passenger liner Kashiwara Maru, converted under emergency requisition in 1940, when Japan's carrier losses outpaced construction and treaty limitations, left the Imperial Navy desperately short of flight decks. Construction records from Kawasaki Shipyard in Kobe show Kashiwara Maru's keel laid in 1939 as a luxury liner for Nippon Yusen Kaisha, the NYK line. She was designed for the Japan to South America passenger route, a fast, comfortable ship with large cargo holds and spacious promenades. But when Japan withdrew from the Washington and London naval treaties in 1936 and began rapid rearmament, civilian assets became military targets for conversion. In November 1940, with war clouds gathering and carrier construction unable to meet operational demands, the Imperial Navy requisitioned Kashiwara Maru. What followed was a rushed, improvised conversion. Her passenger decks were stripped. A flight deck was built over the superstructure. A resting gear was installed. Elevators were added to move aircraft between hangar and flight deck. She emerged in July 1942 as Hiyo, a fleet carrier on paper, but fundamentally still a passenger liner underneath. The conversion left known structural weaknesses documented in Japanese naval archives. Her steam turbines, designed for economical cruising at 18-20 knots, were pushed to 25 knots and beyond for carrier operations. Engineering logs from her early service record chronic vibration issues at high speed. Her armor protection was minimal, just enough to resist shrapnel and small caliber fire. Nothing that could stop torpedoes or armor-piercing bombs. Her aviation fuel systems, retrofitted into spaces never designed for volatile liquids, lacked the redundant safety features of purpose-built carriers. By June 1944, Hiyo had participated in several operations. The invasion of the Aleutian Islands in mid-1942, convoy escort duties, and training operations in home waters. She'd seen combat, but never major fleet action. Her crew knew the ship's limitations. Personal letters from crew members, preserved in Japanese archives and translated by naval historians, reference concerns about the ship's seaworthiness. One engineering officer wrote to his family in May 1944, "We do what we can, but this ship was not meant for what they ask of her." Japan's carrier fleet by mid-1944 was a shadow of what struck Pearl Harbor. Losses at Midway, Coral Sea, and the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign had gutted the fleet's strength. Of the 6 carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, only one Zuikaku remained operational by June 1944. The rest were sunk, damaged beyond repair. Anchorage in the Philippines on June 13, 1944. As part of Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet, she carried a reduced air group, perhaps 40 to 50 aircraft instead of her theoretical capacity of 53, because Japan no longer had trained pilots or modern aircraft to fill her decks. Her crew complement was approximately 1,224 officers and men, standard for a carrier of her size. But there are gaps in the historical record that have never been fully explained. Escort destroyer logs, partially preserved in Japanese archives, note Hiyo riding lower in the water than expected for her documented fuel and ammunition load. Departure manifests from Tawi-Tawi list aviation supplies and spare parts in cargo holds. but don't specify contents or quantities. Post-war interrogations of surviving officers contain cryptic references to special cargo that none would elaborate on. Official records say Hiyo sailed as a standard fleet carrier, but the evidence, fragmentary, contradictory, deliberately vague, suggests a ship carrying more than her manifests acknowledged. And whatever it would kill her before American weapons had the chance. On June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which Americans would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, annihilated Japan's carrier air power in one of the most lopsided naval engagements in history. Hiyo survived the first day's slaughter, only to die on the second from wounds that shouldn't have been fatal. The battle began at dawn on June 19th, when Admiral Ozawa launched massive airstrikes against American carriers defending the Mariana Islands invasion. It was catastrophic. U.S. fighters, equipped with radar-directed intercepts and flown by experienced pilots, slaughtered Japanese air groups. By nightfall, Japan had lost approximately 350 to 400 aircraft, 3/4 of its carrier strength for minimal American losses. Only 35 Japanese aircraft returned from the day's strikes. Hiyo launched aircraft that morning, but recovered almost none. Her flight deck stood nearly empty as night fell. Ozawa retreated westward, hoping to escape detection and regroup, but American submarines were hunting. USS Kavala torpedoed and sank the carrier Shokaku that afternoon. USS Albacore torpedoed Taiho, Japan's newest and largest carrier, which exploded hours later from gasoline vapor ignition. On the afternoon of June 20th, American carrier air groups from Task Force 58 launched a long-range strike to finish the retreating Japanese fleet. At maximum range over 300 miles from the American carriers, they found Ozawa's battered ships. Attack reports from USS Belleau Woods Air Group, preserved in U.S. Naval Archives, document what happened next. At approximately 6:20 p.m., torpedo bombers spotted Hiyo sailing in formation. Multiple aircraft attacked. At least one torpedo, possibly two, struck her starboard side, amidships near the aviation fuel tanks and hangar deck. Initial damage appeared survivable. Hiyo maintained way and began damage control procedures. But survivor accounts, collected during post-war interrogations by U.S. naval intelligence, describe what happened next with disturbing consistency. Approximately 20-30 minutes after the torpedo hits, a massive internal explosion erupted from the hangar deck. Not a gradual fire spreading, not controlled burning. An explosion, violent enough to blow sections of the flight deck upward and tear open hull plating from internal pressure. The cause, according to multiple survivors and supported by naval engineering analysis, ignited aviation gasoline vapors. Hiyo's fuel systems, damaged by the torpedo hit, leaked gasoline into the enclosed hangar space. Vapors accumulated. A spark from damaged electrical systems, from hot metal, from any of a dozen sources in a damaged ship ignited them. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. One survivor, interviewed in 1945, described it. The deck lifted beneath our feet. Fire came from below like a volcano. Men were thrown into the air. The explosions continued one after another as fire reached fuel lines and ammunition. Hiyo's list became uncontrollable, flooding overwhelmed pumps. Fires raged through ventilation systems. At approximately 7:32 hours, barely 70 minutes after the initial torpedo hit, she capsized and sank, bow first, sliding beneath the surface so quickly that hundreds of crew members were trapped below decks. Of approximately 1,224 men aboard, roughly 247 were killed. Survivors were pulled from the water by escorting destroyers, but many died from injuries, burns, or fuel oil ingestion in the hours and days that followed. The loss of Hiyo fits a pattern that haunted Japanese carrier operations throughout the war. Inadequate damage control and catastrophic secondary explosions from poor fuel handling and firefighting procedures. Purpose-built American carriers like USS Yorktown damaged at Midway and Coral Sea, and USS Enterprise hit multiple times, survived devastating attacks through aggressive damage control, redundant fire suppression systems, and crew training that emphasized containment. Japanese carriers, particularly converted vessels like Hiyo, lacked these capabilities. Hiyo's conversion from passenger liner meant her internal compartmentalization was poor. Fuel systems ran through spaces never designed for them. Ventilation systems spread fires rather than containing them. Crew training emphasized offensive operations, launching and recovering aircraft over defensive damage control. But there are aspects of Hiyo's loss that don't fully align with standard torpedo damage. The speed of her sinking 70 minutes from hit to capsizing is unusually fast for a carrier that size. The violence of the internal explosions, described by survivors as continuous and escalating, suggests fuel loads or storage configurations beyond normal operations. Post-war analysis by U.S. Navy technical intelligence teams, examining survivor testimony and Japanese records, noted Hiyo was carrying unusually large quantities of aviation gasoline compared to her air group size. One analyst report, declassified in the 1970s, speculated she was serving double duty as a fuel transport ferrying aviation gasoline from Japanese-controlled refineries to forward bases where it was desperately needed. This wasn't uncommon. By mid-1944, American submarines had devastated Japanese tanker fleets. Fuel was so scarce that combat vessels were occasionally pressed into transport duty, using their higher speed and better protection to run blockades. If Hiyo was carrying excess fuel stored improperly in spaces without adequate safety systems, that would explain the catastrophic secondary explosions. It would explain the rapid loss, and it would explain why official manifests and survivor accounts don't quite match. Official records say Hiyo sank from aerial torpedo damage and poor damage control, but the timeline is too fast, the explosions too violent, and the fuel loads too large for a carrier with barely any aircraft left. Something else was aboard that ship, and it killed her from within. Post-war interrogations of Hiyo survivors reveal consistent gaps, questions the men wouldn't answer, topics they deflected, and references to cargo or operations they claimed not to know about or weren't authorized to discuss. U.S. Naval Intelligence conducted extensive interrogations of Japanese POWs and repatriated personnel after the war, now preserved in the National Archives. Hiyo survivors were questioned about the ship's loss, her operations, and conditions aboard. Most provided straightforward technical details: torpedo hit locations, damage control efforts, sequence of explosions. But when questioned about cargo, fuel loads, or passengers beyond standard crew, responses became evasive. Multiple interrogation transcripts note survivors claiming they didn't know what was in the holds or weren't permitted in those spaces. One officer, when asked about fuel capacity, stated Hiyo carried standard load, but couldn't explain why she was riding low in the water at departure, a detail noted by escort destroyer crews. Escort destroyer logs from ships that picked up survivors contain references to recovering more personnel than expected based on reported crew size. One destroyer's log notes taking aboard approximately 280 survivors when Hiyo's documented crew was 1,024, with 247 killed, which should have left fewer survivors given that multiple destroyers participated in rescue operations. Japanese records from Tawi-Tawi regarding pre-departure operations have gaps. Manifest list generic categories: aviation supplies, munitions, provisions, without itemization common in other carrier departure records. Fuel loading logs show timestamps but not quantities, unusual for documentation that typically tracked every liter due to severe shortages. There's another anomaly buried in casualty records. Among the confirmed dead are names that don't appear in standard IJN personnel rosters cross-referenced by post-war historians. Several individuals listed as lost with Hiyo have no service records, no enlistment documentation, no home addresses listed in standard format. They are names without histories. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of conspiracy. Record keeping in the final year of the war was chaotic. Documents were lost, destroyed in air raids, or deliberately burned during Japan's surrender to prevent war crimes evidence from being captured. Personnel rosters were incomplete, manifests were rushed. But the pattern of gaps is suggestive. If Hiyo was indeed serving double duty as fuel transport, that would explain vague manifests. Acknowledging excess gasoline in official records would reveal operational desperation Japan wanted to conceal. If she carried personnel beyond standard crew, perhaps technical specialists, intelligence officers, or passengers being evacuated from forward bases, that would explain survivors' evasiveness and undocumented names in casualty lists. There's historical precedent. Other Japanese carriers are documented to have carried non-standard cargo or passengers. Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship into a carrier, was sunk on her maiden voyage in November 1944 while transporting Yokosuka Naval Arsenal workers, and equipment cargo never officially manifested. Multiple destroyers and cruisers carried evacuees from bypassed garrisons in 1944-45, often unrecorded, to avoid acknowledging the scale of retreats. The question isn't whether Japanese naval vessels carried undocumented cargo and passengers in 1944. That's established fact. The question is, what specifically Hiyo carried, and why survivors consistently avoided discussing it. Cross-referencing available evidence suggests possibilities. First, excess aviation fuel stored improperly, likely in spaces not designed for it, creating the conditions for catastrophic explosion. This is supported by the violence and speed of her loss, by analyst reports noting unusual fuel quantities, and by the strategic context of desperate fuel shortages. Second, possible transport of technical equipment or personnel from Philippines bases to Japan, as American advances threatened those facilities. Tawi-Tawi was a forward anchorage that would be abandoned within weeks. Evacuating valuable assets would be logical. Third, potentially carrying supplies destined for other bases, spare parts, ammunition, or equipment being redistributed as Japan's logistics network collapsed. None of this involves exotic conspiracy theories. It's the mundane reality of a losing military power improvising with inadequate resources. But it's also the reality that official records written to present competence and control deliberately obscured. The survivors of Hiyo went home after the war, rebuilt their lives, and largely stayed silent about what happened. When pressed, they talked about the battle, the explosions, the rescue. But when asked what the ship was carrying or who else was aboard, they looked away. Some things, it seems, went down with the ship and were meant to stay there. 80 years after she sank, IJN Hiyō remains lost somewhere in the Philippine Sea, lying in approximately 16,000 feet of water, in a location narrowed by survivor accounts and battle reports, but never precisely determined, and raising questions about whether she should ever be found. Survivor accounts and U.S. attack reports place Hiyo's sinking at approximately 15 degrees north, 135 or 137 degrees east, in the Philippine Sea's abyssal plain. The seafloor in this region averages 15,000 to 18,000 feet deep, beyond recreational diving, beyond most salvage capability, accessible only to specialized deep-sea research submersibles and ROVs. Several major Pacific wreck expeditions have searched these waters. Paul Allen's RV Petrel, before Allen's death in 2018 and the project's suspension, discovered numerous WOP wrecks including USS Lexington, USS Indianapolis, USS Juno, and Japanese vessels Musashi, Hiei, Kirishima, and carriers Kaga and Takagi, but not Hiyo. Other expeditions by organizations like Nauticos LLC and Jamstec have surveyed the Philippine Sea for historical and geological purposes. None have reported finding her. The challenge isn't just depth, it's area. Even with survivor accounts narrowing the search zone, that still leaves hundreds of square miles of featureless seafloor, requiring systematic sonar mapping. Deep-sea search operations are expensive. RV Petrel's operating costs exceeded $10 million annually and require months of survey time. There's also the question of whether she should be found. Under international law and Japanese national policy, IJN war losses are considered war graves. Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare classifies all sunken naval vessels with casualties as protected sites. Disturbance, artifact removal, or invasive research is opposed on cultural and religious grounds, particularly under Shinto traditions regarding the dead. This conflicts with archaeological and historical interests. Wreck sites are archives, physical evidence that can answer questions. Documents can't. Hiyo's remains, if found and carefully surveyed, could reveal fuel storage configurations, cargo hold contents, structural damage patterns, and material evidence confirming or refuting the speculation surrounding her loss. The precedent exists. USS Indianapolis, found by RV Petrel in 2017, was surveyed with U.S. Navy approval under strict protocols. No artifact removal, no disturbance of human remains, purely photographic documentation. Japanese wrecks found by the same expedition have been handled similarly, with coordination between expedition teams, naval authorities, and family groups. The loss of Hiyo carries meaning beyond one ship's fate. She represents the collapse of Japan's naval aviation, a force that dominated the Pacific in 1941–42, but was systematically destroyed by 1944 through attrition, training failures, and industrial incapacity to replace losses. Of the carriers that fought at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, only Zuikaku survived, and she would be sunk 4 months later at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Japan's carrier fleet, the instrument of Pearl Harbor, the weapon that was supposed to secure the empire's perimeter, ceased to exist as an effective force after June 1944. Hiyo's loss also illustrates the desperation of Japan's strategic position by mid-1944. That a converted liner with known structural flaws was pressed into frontline service shows how depleted the fleet had become. That she may have been doubling as a fuel transport shows how completely American submarines had severed Japan's logistics. That her crew went into battle knowing the ship's weaknesses shows the fatalism that had infected Japanese naval operations as defeat became inevitable. For families of the 247 men who died with her, Hiyo's loss is deeply personal. Some have advocated for the wreck to remain undisturbed, a war grave where their relatives rest. Others have expressed hope that a discovery might provide closure, confirmation, perhaps even recovery of personal effects that could be repatriated. Environmental considerations also factor. If Hiyo is carrying significant fuel oil, and if her tanks are corroding after 8 decades underwater, she could pose an ecological threat similar to other WTE wrecks that have begun leaking. USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor continues to leak oil 80 years after sinking. Several Japanese wrecks in shallow Pacific waters have required environmental monitoring or remediation. At 16,000 feet, any environmental impact would be minimal and localized, but it's still a consideration for deep-sea ecosystems we barely understand. The ultimate question is priority. Deep-sea archaeology resources are limited. Every expedition that searches for Hiyo is an expedition that doesn't search for other historically significant wrecks. Is solving the mysteries of one converted carrier worth the investment when other wrecks, perhaps with clearer historical importance or greater closure value for families, remain unfound? Somewhere in the darkness of the Philippine Sea, Hiyo lies on the abyssal plain. Her flight deck, if intact, still carries the scars of her final battle. Her hangar spaces hold wreckage of aircraft that never flew again. Her cargo holds contain whatever she was carrying, mundane supplies, perhaps, or evidence of the improvisations and secrets that define Japan's losing war. The men who died with her are still aboard, entombed in a steel monument no one has seen. The questions about what she carried, why she exploded so violently, why survivors wouldn't discuss certain topics, those questions remain unanswered, not because evidence doesn't exist, but because it rests in a place we haven't reached. And maybe that's how it should be. Some stories are complete without endings. Some questions are answered by acknowledging we may never know. Some graves are best left undisturbed, their secrets kept by the ocean that claimed them. But if an expedition ever does find her, if ROVs ever descend through 3 miles of black water to illuminate her remains, the first question won't be about torpedo damage or structural failure. It will be simpler and harder to answer. What were you really carrying? And why did it matter enough to stay silent?